I'm Edwin Warfield, the publisher of Citybiz, and I'm honored today to interview Zally Ahmadi, who is a senior vice president at DF King and Company. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
As senior vice president of corporate governance, ESG, and executive compensation, what are your responsibilities at DF King?
So, my role oversees a lot of the advisory services that DF King provides with a focus on those related to ESG and compensation. And what that usually means is, there's a lot of research on our end on shareholder proposals and other issues that affect publicly listed companies, and in particular, topics that might come up during engagement meetings with their investors.
And can you provide an overview of some of the recent trends that we're seeing in shareholder proposals?
Yes. So we are seeing a lot more of them on ballots, right? So over a 20% increase in proposals that went to a vote over the previous years is what we saw in 2022. So we're seeing less withdrawals, less omissions. And even when you're just looking at shareholder proposal submissions, right? Environmental proposal submissions have increased by 50% this year. But the one notable thing that I really want to point out is that average support is lower. So even though we're seeing all of these increases across the board, we're seeing average support, especially in certain categories, somewhat lower than we've seen over previous years. And then just in general, hot topics reflect familiar themes that we've seen over the past couple of years: greenhouse gas emissions, diversity, special meeting rights, political contributions, etc.
And can you drill a little deeper into each category: environmental, social, and governance? So what are you seeing? What's top of mind in terms of environmental?
Sure. So, we that's a great way to frame it because we find that separating the E, the S, and the G it's kind of the best way to dissect trends, kind of on a more granular level. So if we start with environmental, this year, nearly a quarter of the proposals on ballots receive majority support, right? So face value, that sounds like a lot, right? But when you look at the previous year, almost 50% the previous year saw majority shareholder support, right? So we're seeing a departure in the level of support that many of the largest investors have historically provided. And many of the requests within the proposals, they become increasingly prescriptive, which we think has contributed to the decrease in average investor support as well. Aside from that, the number of greenhouse gas related proposals have quadrupled over the previous year. So that was something that was a pretty notable trend that we saw. And then just generally speaking for environmental, requests regarding climate change reporting and greenhouse gas emissions, those remain the most popular categories for proponents that are submitting these types of proposals. For social initiatives, if we're moving on from the E to the S, for social initiatives, proposals requesting a racial equity audit have been trending this year. So these proposals, they initially cropped up following the civil rights movement surrounding the George Floyd protests, and many of them are now seeing majority shareholder support in 2022. Labor issues as well, they also took center stage this year. And those types of proposals, those are the ones that request the adoption of paid sick leave, reporting on concealment clauses, that sort of thing. Political contributions disclosure as well, lobbying related disclosure, those took the number one spot for social proposals, and that's in line with what we've seen in previous years. They typically take the number one spot. They're pretty heavy in terms of volume, in terms of submissions, and we anticipate that to continue. The political and regulatory landscape isn't really changing, so we anticipate proponents to kind of continue to push for more disclosure there. And then lastly, for social, the one thing I also want to bring up is, we're seeing a lot of anti-ESG proposal submissions. They're higher than ever before. And those serve as kind of a counter proposal, right, to those that push for ESG initiative. And these are proposals, that request things like, please don't fly the pride flag at campuses for work, or what are the benefits of becoming a public benefit corporation, or what are the cost benefits there. So those are the main topics for social initiatives. And then lastly, for governance, we're seeing the same topics that have historically been trending: special meeting rights, independent chair, proxy access. The governance landscape has been one that's historically been shaped by some of the more well-known retail proponents. Some people refer to them as gadflies, and they continue to dominate this space.
And what role are you seeing of the big state pension funds? Are they playing a more active role in the governance?
They're We're seeing a lot. Their votes matter, right? So it depends on how you define activist role, right? Certainly, some of the more popular ones have been much more vocal in terms of governance initiatives that they want to see. I mean, initiatives like diversity comes to mind, right? But at the end of the day, they will always have their key role in that, they're a big influencer in terms of the votes that they hold. And these shareholder proposals matter, whether they're, brought by those types of proponents or whether they're voting on them.
And so, if you were to sort of rank the top proposals out there, what are you seeing as the major proposals, top proposals out there?
So we like to look at top 10 proposals year over year. It gives us kind of a bird's eye view of the landscape. It helps us identify, what might be coming in terms of how investors change their voting policies or what might be asked during engagement sessions. And what we're seeing just over this past year, we're seeing a lot more environmental social influence, right? So historically, if you look at like 5, 10 years ago, very governance dominated, right? Proxy access, special meeting, written consent, those were the main key proposals. Now we're seeing issues like climate change is number three, GHG emissions, I believe GHG is number three, climate change is number four. We're seeing political lobbying contributions. That's the number two spot. So we're seeing a lot more environmental, social initiatives. Racial equity, I mentioned before, that's in the top 10 now. It didn't make the top 10 any year previously, right? And even issues like anti-ESG proposals, those made the top 10 this year as well, and that's never happened historically. So we're seeing much more proliferation of environmental, social initiatives, and kind of within those two categories, the top of mind, environmental, greenhouse gas, right? For social, racial equity, even diversity, workforce diversity, those types of topics come to mind when you think top proposals.
And is that the large institutions would they be replicating those priorities?
They definitely they work side by side with what a lot of the larger institutions have published as their priorities. So, for example, let's take workforce diversity, right? Workforce diversity is something that a lot of the larger institutions are getting behind in terms of the disclosure that they want to see. State Street, for example, they want to see S&P 500 publish their EEO-1 survey results. BlackRock wants to see workforce diversity being addressed. And last year, if we look at 2021 proposals, workforce diversity was near number one in the number of submissions that are there. So we do see, priorities for investors reflect what a lot of those key trends are in terms of shareholder proposals. And I think that's why DF King monitors shareholder proposals so closely as well. So a lot of the times when we just discuss key trends in shareholder proposals, understanding that even though those are lobbied at mostly the S&P 500, it really matters across the board for all companies who are looking to engage with their investors, because it does reflect the evolving priorities that investors take on when they see, what's ending up on ballots and how that should factor into their updates.
And so, how and sort of what impact are the corporate gadflies having on governance?
You know what? That's a good question. Corporate gadflies, I feel, get a lot of hate from public companies, but their influence, it can't be denied. They shape a lot of the governance space, right? So when you're looking at E, the S, and the G is very much dominated by the gadflies, and it really has over the last 10 years. A lot of their efforts with the shareholder proposals that they put forth, it really has changed what we're seeing in terms of governance provisions across the S&P. For example, classified boards mostly phased out. We're not seeing a lot of those anymore, right? Special meeting rights, that's evolved significantly over the last few years because of the push that these gadflies have been putting forth. Even written consent provisions, they do have their influence there. So they're certainly not, they're not a force to be ignored. As much as many companies would like to. But this year, what's interesting is that we are seeing them move a little bit more into the ENS space. And that's kind of, a TBD situation to see whether they'll move further into that space going forward. But for now, they very much dominate the governance realm.
And so, what trend do you see in terms of setting up independent chairs? It seems that's a less topical topic. It seems people are less adamant about that than it was a few years ago.
I know, it was a pretty scary topic a few years ago. We are seeing, so for example, let's look at the S&P 500. It's about 60% of the S&P do have an independent chair, right? So the numbers are moving toward that direction. When you look at the push in terms of shareholder proposals, you're not seeing them pass en masse, right? Larger investors definitely take a case by case approach when it comes to whether a company should have an independent chair or not. For a lot of companies, when they don't have an independent chair, they have pretty robust, uh, you know, uh, presiding director, lead independent director role, which most of the time investors are okay with. Average shareholder proposal supports for independent chair are typically in the high 30s, low 40s. So you're not seeing them all pass there. And that kind of reflects, this slow trend of adopting independent chair, but it's not necessarily what every company is doing.
And what is the state of diversity initiatives? How are they progressing? Well,
Diversity is such a great topic because it encompasses so much now. If, 10 years ago, diversity in this context was just board gender diversity, right? It was how many females are on your board, right? And over the past few years, that conversation has really evolved, right? And through a lot of different means. One that comes to mind is the New York Comptrollers initiatives. For example, their board accountability project really pushed for more disclosure on the diversity of the board, but not just gender. We're talking skill set, we're talking ethnicity, we're talking about why, tell us about why your director is right for this board, and how does that play in the context of diversity. And even outside of that, look at their initiative in the past couple of years just on workforce diversity reporting, right? Last year, the workforce diversity reporting shareholder proposals averaged over 50% shareholder support, which is a really big deal in the shareholder proposal world. State Street, I mentioned, has a policy now where they look to see that disclosure, or they'll vote against directors if they don't see it, right? So diversity now is so much more than just gender board diversity. It's workforce diversity, it's skill set diversity, it's ethnic diversity. And then you see, proxy advisory firms, even like ISS and Glass Lewis, and they've updated their policies incrementally over the last couple years to address this shift in what diversity means to them, right? So now they're actually looking at the ethnic diversity of the board, the racial makeup of the board. They're looking at whether workforce diversity is published, that sort of thing.
so, what are some of the quick takeaways from governance from your view?
I think that a lot of what I have mentioned so far, it kind of comes up to this main takeaway that engagement with investors is so much more important than it has been before. So, for example, more shareholder proposals are on ballots, right? And companies are going to need to engage with their investors to see where they might end up on these proposals, to see whether their investors support these or not. It's not like the years past where it was much more black and white in terms of how a shareholder proposal would come out. There are way more shared shades of gray, especially with ENS, playing into the mix. So I think that engagement with investors has become much more of a priority, and I think that that's probably the main takeaway that we're seeing from all of these governance trends that have emerged.
So, Zally, is there any part of your story and your role at DF King that we have that you haven't shared with us? Is there something else? Was there a question I should have asked that I didn't ask?
I think that, when we're looking at everything from kind of a bird's eye view, 10 to 15-minute capsule like this, I think that those are probably the main topics that we've covered. I think going forward, maybe things that we're anticipating for 2023, we're seeing a lot of a continuation of themes that we've seen for 2022. We anticipate a continuation of racial equity initiatives. We anticipate a continuation of diversity initiatives as well. One thing to note is that we're seeing average support for diversity proposals fall this year. It's very easy to look at that and say, okay, well, maybe diversity isn't as hot as it was. That's not necessarily the case. It's more so that, investors on their end have engaged in a more heavier context with companies about what they want to see. Companies are making more advances in terms of their disclosure, and that's why the proposals aren't receiving as much support. So that's kind of the only thing that I would cover that we haven't yet is what we might see for 2023. And I would say that a continuation of the themes that we're seeing so far is definitely in order. Even for the environmental side, climate change reporting, greenhouse gas emissions, net zero is going to be a big topic for 2023. And then in terms of governance, we're not really reinventing the wheel when it comes to governance there. So again, a continuation of special meeting rights, lead independent director. I mean, it's been in the top 10 for the last 10 years, so no reason to say that it won't be going forward, even if, they aren't passing all of them.
Well, Zally, I want to thank you for sharing your insights and perspective. And please keep us apprised as you move forward in your career at DFK.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me.